Okay, today I want to talk about the terrain editing tools that we have in Unity. So let me get a share screen going here. So first thing to do to make a terrain is to make a terrain. These are game objects, 3D terrain, and this makes our terrain. Uh, and we can see here in assets, it's made a new terrain. This is the terrain object that lives in our project view, and it's kind of like a prefab. So the first thing I want to do is set the dimensions. So in here I pick the gear, and I go down and I specify the width, length, and height. And I think I want my width and height to each be 500. So I'll set the width to 500. The length to 500. That's in the Z direction. And the height I'll set to 50, I think. Is that what it says? Yeah, 50. So, so with that, my terrain now is a little more manageable. I can kind of focus in on it. I'm not sure why it's black there. There we go. So with the terrain editor, the first of these buttons on the terrain editor, this one makes terrains around it. So if I were to click on one of these squares, it would make another copy of the terrain, same size and dimensions. But we're not going to do that. That's for bigger worlds. The buttons that we're kind of interested in is the paint button, the second button. And it has a number of choices underneath it. The first of which is the paint button. And I'm going to set the height. Now, I'm going to set the height to 20. And I'm going to specify that I want to flatten all of the world. I seem to have gotten an extra there. I'm going to set the height to 20 and then press the flatten all button. That flattens the whole thing. And the point of doing this is that later, as I'm building mountains, I can also build lakes by pushing it down. So the whole terrain is a height of 20. The terrain goes from 0 to 50. So that means I can push the terrain down to make depressions, and I can pull the terrain up to make mountains. You can also do this with brushes. We'll talk about brushes in a minute. So now I've kind of defined my my terrain. It's 500 by 500, going from 0 to 50, and the whole thing is set at 20 meters right now. And by the way, the units are essentially meters. We know this because if we look in the physics settings, the default acceleration of gravity in Unity is 9.81 meters per second squared. So that means we're working in units of meters. So still with the paintbrush button, I'm going to select the razor lower terrain. And with this coupled with the brushes, which we can select from that palette, let us raise and lower the terrain. Left mouse button clicking raises, shift left mouse button lowers the terrain. And I also recommend setting the light to be at a kind of low angle uh, so that the terrain more clearly shows as we paint it. I don't know why that black artifact is there. Another thing that you'll notice here, this is now down here. It was baking the light. One thing that is kind of important to do before you start doing a whole bunch of stuff is go into the lighting window, which you can find from uh, uh, the window setting here, general uh, rendering lighting settings, and I've already docked it here. But I want to be sure and turn off real-time lighting and turn off mixed lighting. These are things that we'll talk about later that have to do with global illumination. Uh, and it's expensive. It runs in the background. It sucks a lot of cycles out of your uh, computer. And every time you change something, it has to go in and redo it again. So it puts a lot of load. Turn these two off, and you might turn off auto generate too. And this way the lighting is not taking cycles out of your computer. So anyway, we're ready to paint some terrain here. So I'll pick the paint button. I'll pick the raise or lower terrain. I'll pick a nice brush. Notice we have lots of different shapes and styles for the brushes. Some of them, uh, that's a really weird one. I'll pick that one. And right now the brush is huge. So I'm going to set the brush down to 100. So now my brush is a more reasonable size. And the opacity, I think I want to set at 50. Opacity is how heavily the effect of painting is. The bigger the number of opacity is, the stronger the effect of painting terrain is. So I'll go ahead here and paint terrain. And so you can see this kind of ridge forming here as I'm painting. It's kind of wrinkly because the brush that I'm using is kind of wrinkly. But that's painted some terrain on there. And because I have the light kind of low, I can see the shadow and highlights of the terrain. If I do a shift paint, this is going to push it down. So here I'm now pushing a hole into the terrain, and it pushes it down as far as 0, the default terrain height being 20. As we go through the different options of the paint button, we also have that set height that I mentioned. I can use this with a brush, and what this will do is it will move it towards 20, whether it's higher or lower, it will move it towards that 20. So if I painted through here, this would be moving the height towards that 20 default setting. Smooth height, which is another choice, again, just smooths. It does kind of a blur of whatever the terrain is. And again, it's done with brushes. If you want to smooth the whole terrain, you can kind of pick a big brush with a strong opacity and smooth the whole terrain. The next button is the paint texture button. So the next button here is to paint texture. And again, we have a brush that we can use to paint the texture, but we have to add a layer. We have to add a texture that we want to paint. And so I'm going to create a layer. And I don't want a banana tree. So I'm going to find a grass. sand. There's a beach sand. That's a texture. So you see immediately that paints the entire terrain with that texture. I'll add another one. Um, this time, let's do it. Grass. Grass. It's important when we choose these that we don't pick these uh, ones that show images of grass. These we'll use later. Instead, I'm going to pick one that's one of these textures for painting terrain. The grass hill. I'll pick that one. Um, so now I have the grass hill, and now I can go over here, and I'm going to change the brush a little bit. I'm going to set this down to about 10. If I left it at 50, it would essentially replace the texture that's underneath it. But by setting that opacity lower, it's going to kind of blend it in with the sand. So it's a more subtle effect in terms of how it paints the terrain. So here I'm just kind of blending it in with the sand texture. Uh, we'll be able to see this better when we get down on the ground and have a look at things. So you can add as many textures as you want. The textures, by the way, there's some in the standard assets under the terrain assets surface textures. And there's also a terrain demo assets package that's on the Google Drive that has a lot of nice textures in it. Let's put that character in. I've already loaded the standard assets first person character, and I've got a prefab here. So I'll drop that character in the middle here, and I'll turn off the main camera because my first person character has its own camera. So at this point, we're ready to kind of look around the scene. And so there are the mountains that we painted over there. Here's the hole that we pressed down into the terrain. And you can see as we get up on the hill here, there's that flat spot that we painted. And you can see the terrain. Let me do one thing here. Let me generate lighting so that brings up the colors better. So we've got our little character to walk around, and we'll go on. Okay, so the next tab we'll look at is for placing trees. So again, in the terrain, here's the tree button, and it works the same way. There are brushes. Here we have something called tree density instead of opacity, which kind of is the strength of the tree painting button. And I'm gonna, of course, have to add a tree. From the standard assets, there's one called broadleaf. Broadleaf, B-R-O-A-D. I thought there was one. Where's the broadleaf tree? Apparently I haven't brought that in yet. Well, anyway, I'll use the banyan tree. Banyan tree is a good one. Now, with the with the ones that come from Standard Assets, they're called speed trees, and they're a little fancier than this old-fashioned banyan tree. But this one does have the feature of a bend factor, which is how much it blows in the wind. Uh, there's wind in Unity, so I'll add that tree. And here I now have a banyan tree, selecting that with a brush size. What did we use? We used 100. Somewhere, we don't get a choice of a brush, and I'll set this down to maybe 10. And now I'll paint some trees onto the landscape. You can set things like the tree height. Right now it's random, but I can set this to different values. So if I want to make smaller trees, I can make smaller trees. There's also a mass place trees. I don't want to put 10,000 trees on here, but I might want to put 100, and this will keep the existing trees, but if I unclick that, it'll replace them all. And so it's 100 trees randomly placed onto the world. If I bring in the standard assets for the environment, these are the standard assets segregated into categories, which I highly recommend. And I can bring in all of those, and you'll see that we get some additional trees, the speed trees, that are fancier trees than that old banyan one. Whoops. That's the standard error that you get with the old standard assets. There are these two scripts that throw errors, and all you have to do is delete them. So let's add a couple of those broadleaf trees. What's a broadleaf tree? There it is. There's a broadleaf mobile and a broadleaf desktop. I'll pick the desktop. And notice I don't have that bend factor anymore. The speed trees are fancier. And I'll mass place a bunch of them, say 50 of them, and I'll keep the existing trees. And now we have some of those trees. Whole screen. So there are my trees scattered around the landscape. This is one of the broadleaf trees, and this is one of the banyan trees. Something we'll see later with the old-fashioned trees is that they turn into billboards if you get too far from them. I'll show you that setting later. The fourth tab works kind of the same way, except it's designed for doing flowers. So this tab lets us paint grass and flowers, the details. It also lets you paint rocks, although it doesn't work very well. As with the trees, we have to add a grass detail here. And I think where's the grass? So here's a grass. The details are these kind of special textures that have alpha channel that makes part of it invisible. So this looks like it's completely opaque, but in fact, when we actually paint with this, it'll make kind of grassy looking things. There are various settings here that you can futz with, and we're now ready to paint grass. Um, One thing about the grass is that it's pretty laggy, so you want to make the brush fairly small and make the opacity really low, like 0.001. And also, as you paint grass, you should probably get in close to the terrain to actually uh, see the effect of painting grass here. So if I want to paint some grass around my character, I get the terrain and the detail, and I'll pick this grass. I've got a brush. I've set it to be 10. So there's the size of my brush. And so as I click, I'm putting down pieces of grass around the character. Notice the fronds of this thing. That's that alpha channel trick. So if I play this now, I'm going to find that my character is surrounded by this grass. And these are billboard textures, which are kind of a cheat to make things that are two-dimensional look three-dimensional. The billboards are two-dimensional textures, but they're designed to always face the camera. So no matter where I go, these things always face my camera. Notice that the grass sways in the wind, a nice trick to make things look more realistic. There are various settings for the wind that we'll maybe talk about later, or you can read about it. And of course, there are many grasses with some with different flowers and other kinds of stuff. You can also paint objects with the detail tool. If you uh, uh, pick detailed mesh, this will paint meshes. I believe there's some rocks in here that you can paint, works the same way. When you're painting mesh objects, you want to set the colors to white and the bottom tab to lit vertex. The drawback to these meshes is they don't have colliders, so you may paint rocks, but they're not something you can walk on. A warning again about the textures. When we paint terrain with texture, we want to use one of these special textures. These are actually very special textures in that they're designed to match up the left side with the right side. They're called seamless textures. And the bottom and the top match up so that as you tile these textures out onto the world, they repeat, but they don't have obvious seams between the edges of the tiles. For the grasses that were the details, we want to use one of these textures that has this fancy alpha channel in it. All that's visible are the fronds, the spiky things, and this background is invisible. So be aware of that. You can't mix the two. So the last tab, which we already opened up one time when we were setting the size, is the gear, which sets a whole bunch of settings for your terrain. We already saw that it set the width, length, and height of our terrain, but it also has settings for the wind, how fast the wind's blowing, its amplitudes, how much it bends. There's settings for the trees and detail, things like when the details become visible, how far you can see. There's billboard start with the old-fashioned trees. When they're more than 50 meters away, instead of displaying them as a three-dimensional object, they're displayed as a billboard, and the fade length is how far that takes to fade in. There's also a maximum number of mesh trees that you can display. Generally, the settings here are all right to leave alone. I'll let you read the manual page for those detailed settings. All right, so I'm going to stop there. Let me stop sharing, and I'm going to end the recording, and I'll see you all in class. We'll pick up with more terrain detail next time.